How can an authentic response to the imposed disaster of contemporary life be constructed? This title is a question I borrowed from American artist Doug Ashford, who has been asking variations on it in many separate texts, exhibitions, and lectures he's produced in the last years. I first came across a version of it in Empathy and Abstraction, an essay in which he tries to reconcile his newfound impulse to make abstract paintings with his long-standing political activism. The problem with abstraction, he explains, is that it implies something non-specific and removed. Abstract ideas and art enable a distancing from real things and people, which could also be perceived as a form of comfortable and complacent seclusion. Empathy, Ashford explains, is often positioned on the very opposite end of that spectrum. It's associated with naturalism, collectivism, and a kind of profound engagement with the world that could also be called love. In the essay, Ashford works hard to show that empathy and abstraction are not opposing forces we must choose between, but instead flip sides of the same coin. He writes, "By asking audiences to remake themselves without reference to the real, in an invented affection for others living and dead, we can show that art can overcome the humiliation of life's present organization. The magic wand of abstraction, when joined to empathy, provides both a release and an opportunity, a moment for the production of new frames of love." Ashford's writing has been incredibly helpful to me while I've been working on my current project. It's called Holding Still and Holding Together. It's a multi-channel video installation, and it has something in common with Hewitt's installation at the power plant, in that the starting point for the project was a series of still images. Before I came across Ashford's question, I was already trying to figure out what an authentic response to the disaster of contemporary life might look like. Specifically, I was thinking about collective action, how it's evolved in recent years, and how I might begin to participate in it. I began searching through images of political protests and street demonstrations, not as artistic research, but as a way to help me understand these forms of very direct, very physical collective action. My search at first was general, but it quickly became more specific. I began to focus on images of protesters lying limp in the arms of police as an act of passive resistance. These came from all different sources, different eras, different political movements. The more time I spent with them, the more I found that they troubled me and moved me and repulsed me all at the same time. But from the beginning, I had a hard time articulating what it was about them that was so confusing, which was why I decided to work with them. I think I was hoping that through the process of making the work, I would come to a clearer understanding of how these images function, what they represent. In the end, that full sense of clarity and resolve never arrived, but the images have nonetheless allowed me to think through important questions around resistance, power, precariousness, nonviolence, and what it means to use your body to describe and enact your politics. The profound stoppage or withdrawal performed by the bodies engaged in this act of passive protest is one possible answer, I think, to Ashford's question. Going limp is a key strategy of passive resistance. It's effective because it functions on more than one level at once. Ideologically, it's a gesture of total non-cooperation with the police or security guards that are trying to remove you from an area. This can be very empowering and a very empowering experience for the protesters, but it also takes a lot more effort to move a limp protester. It ties up police resources by slowing down the process of removing and arresting people. Arguably, it also keeps you safer because a relaxed body bruises less easily than a tense one, and in theory, it should protect the protester from police aggression altogether, because as long as you don't fight or actively resist, the police are supposed to match your restraint, at least by law. This strategy of resistance is fascinating because it's filled with all sorts of contradictions and complications, but my interest really springs from the images themselves and the effect they had on me. The photographs show these incredibly vulnerable bodies, all soft and slumped over, often with their eyes closed and their limbs dangling. And all around them are the police, strong and upright, grabbing at the bodies, lifting them up, heaving them around in all sorts of strange ways. Looking at the images, I found it impossible not to project myself into the situations. They forced me to imagine what it would be like to lay still in the middle of all that chaos, making yourself soft in order to achieve something difficult and urgent. I also began to imagine myself in the bodies of the police. What might it feel like to hold the protesters in so close in order to drag them away? What were they thinking about as they were doing it? Was it possible to dehumanize and degrade someone even as you held them in your arms? I thought for a long time about what to do with the images, how to dig into them more deeply in order to better understand them. In the end, I shot a series of videos which restage and represent the images in a few different ways. The key footage shows a group of dancers at work reproducing the poses, the interactions, and the facial expressions depicted in the original photographs. So in the exhibition, which opens this week at the Ryerson Image Center, there are 5 videos in all. 2 will play on the Rix Media wall at the gallery entrance, and then the other 3 play inside the gallery. 1 is a projection, and 2 are on monitors. So for today, what I thought I would do is I'll play 2 short extracts, about 5 minutes each, from 2 of the videos. And I also just wanted to read an excerpt from a text that I wrote for the performers as we were preparing for the film shoot. It's called Note for Performers, and it's also included in the exhibition as a takeaway. So yeah, you can begin the video. Notes for Performers, Part 1. On the ethics of recreation. It is strange and awful to remove these images from their original context. It is terrible to erase from them the extended struggles that preceded the split second they represent. But that is what I'm asking we do. Together, we will work to replicate the various configurations of bodies depicted in the still images. But in staging these events for the camera, the intention is not to memorialize them. It is to rewrite the power relations they describe. To do this, we will temporarily set aside the imbalance between police and protester. We will erase the street, the violence, the swarming crowds, the yelling, the uniforms, the billy clubs, guns, and riot gear that are the essential constituents of the events. We will turn our focus instead to the bodies as they interact with each other. In the photographs, it is very clear who is who and where the power lies, but in our recreation, we'll ignore those distinctions. Instead of imagining ourselves in the role of police or protester, of state enforcer or dissident, we'll work together as equal and interchangeable agents in a collective experiment of holding still and holding together. We'll remember the nature of the original events, but we'll also think about the times we've held onto other bodies, friends, lovers, children, in very different situations from the ones depicted in these photographs. We'll seek out these overlaps and others in order to better understand how it feels to put our bodies on the line for our politics. What the images show and what they don't show. These images do not represent the standard exchange between police and protester. These are instances in which the peaceful refusal of the protester was met with fair compliance by authorities. These are events in which the cameras were present, and so they are, by and large, peaceful images. But it would be wrong to talk about these images without talking about violence. Most acts of resistance, peaceful and otherwise, are met with an aggressive response. The police regularly hit, kick, pepper spray, and shoot protesters. Sometimes angry mobs form around the protesters and do this job on behalf of the police. Sometimes protesters kick, spit, or charge the police with equal hatred and violence. Sometimes they break windows, set cars on fire, loot, destroy, and provoke. Violence is not represented here, but that is an exception. We must remember that it remains both the condition and the horizon of these events. If these images obscure the violence that is fundamental to them, what is it that they then show us? In the images, we see protesters going limp in the streets as an act of passive resistance. The police, strong and upright all around them, are carrying them away as best they can. Sometimes the limp bodies are being dragged along the pavement, and sometimes they are suspended above the ground. The police hold on to the protesters in positions that are frightening and strangely familiar at once. This is what makes the images confusing. Sometimes protesters look like they are dead or hurt, and then it becomes hard to tell if the police are arresting them or pulling them to safety. Sometimes the police hold the protesters carefully in their arms like children or lovers, and this is confusing too. But when the police are turned towards the camera, we can look at their faces to better understand. Often there is hatred flashing there. Sometimes there is disgust or panic. Other times there is fear and concern. The photographs document political protests from around 1940 to the present. They were produced in the Western world, mainly Canada, the US, and the UK. They show people demonstrating for civil rights, racial equality, organized labor, against nuclear war, environmental destruction, and the inequality generated by rampant network capitalism. Often the protesters close their eyes and hang their heads to signal their absolute evacuation from the moment. But other times they raise their faces to the cameras to smile and mug. Sometimes the limp bodies are strong young women and men, and sometimes they are fragile and old. In any case, you worry for them, because the police bodies are always strong, armed and uniformed, mostly male, mostly white. In praise of complicated images. We are engaging in a project of recreation that is as much about looking as it is about moving, lifting, and posing. Before we begin the physical work, let's look long and hard at these images that resist an easy reading. In a time when our outrage is instant and often expressed through hashtags and status updates, let's engage for a moment in a more complicated type of consideration. Look at these bodies tangled up all together. Trace the line of each limb to its conclusion. Gauge the weight of the body being lifted or dragged, then calculate how it is shared among the lifters. Think about the places where these bodies touch and how the skin must burn and twist there. See how closely these bodies grasp onto one another and consider how that experience might be confusing for those involved. Bone, muscle, and flesh are conspiring here. They are describing the complex conditions under which we are bound up together. How does it feel to be locked deep in this contradictory embrace? What is it like to make yourself vulnerable in the arms of the state? What are the police thinking as they hug these supple bodies in close to them? Where does control lie in this situation? How is it established, and how can it be maintained? Resistance is never an isolated action. It is a series of reciprocal events arising between those with power and those without. Any effective effort of resistance must continuously adapt in response to that which it is resisting, and so there can be no one right way to perform it. But in searching through the disasters of the past for clues as to how to respond to the disaster of the present, these images of passive protest hold some kind of key. There is potential in this action that is not an action at all, but rather its opposite. Through their stillness, their limpness, their lassitude, the bodies are expressing their complete and total non-cooperation with the systems that exploit and degrade them. As the authorities advance, the protester slumps over. Her fists unclench, her head rolls, her limbs go limp and heavy. She is still, but she is not dead. When she stops moving, she is transformed into a heavy burden, deeply inconvenient to the police, who can now neither ignore her nor kick her and cuff her like a common criminal. She becomes both absent and ultra-present at once. Through this action, the protester is also generating an image. Her limp body caught up in the arms of the police shows that she is a being bound up with others, as we all must be, that her life and her freedom are subject to a matrix of power she did not design. Her limp body is signaling her refusal to continue within that system. The force of her action lies in this refusal, which is absolute and unmistakable. But the ingenuity of it lies in how it suppresses the powers and actions of the police. As long as she doesn't fight, tense, or resist, the police must match her restraint, ounce for ounce. This act of passive protest, which looks just like surrender, is an inversion of the system that keeps the political subject bound up in its web. Also, and perhaps most importantly, it is a declaration that new possibilities for revolt continue to spring up from everywhere and at every moment, even from the very center of the oldest mechanisms of our social domination. Perhaps the authorities see these limp bodies as nothing more than a logistical problem that must be removed in order to quell dissent and return to order, but they would be wrong in that assessment. As the cameras rise up all around, these crumpled forms send out their message to those gathering around, all the better to see. We could stop it here if you want.